I'm Scott here with the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division, and what I'm going to do is I had the honor and privilege to serve on this work group along with Kim Allen and my colleague David Jackson to take the IPMR, and see if we could craft it into a document that might be more useful. And sort of our driving force was, I remember several months before we started the project, I was in the old state, was it the Quality Assurance Committee, and Iva Sinclair was there, and we were talking about the IPMR and just how confused of a document it was. And essentially what happened is I think time had passed its usefulness, and so we were trying to figure out what do we want to see this document look like. And I remember Iva Sinclair stating what I thought was the most basic and probably down-to-earth response, and that was, I want to look at this, I want to go to this website, and I want to know how my kid's doing. And if you can create a document like that, that's going to be useful. So we set even though it's a very basic statement, it's a very high mark to meet, because everyone's definition of trying to figure out how their kid is doing is going to be different. But that was sort of our driving force. That was sort of the overall arching goal for us for this document. So we had several meetings trying to figure out how could we move this thing, because it was basically a compliance document. It was built pre-Felix and was trying to figure out how many caseworkers there were the vacancies filled. It was really compliance information that were the goals, and it served its time. But now we were at a point where everybody was actually doing these things. They had positions filled. They had data they were collecting. The question now is, how are you using those data? How are those data being presented, and how can we take a look at how our kids are doing? So after several go-rounds, we came up with these 4 basic questions, and that's I think what guides the data that are in the hyper report. Is it how many clients do you serve? What kind of services do you provide? How much should it cost to offer these services? And most importantly, I think this is where we're moving, is outcomes. What were the outcomes of the clients you serve? Because it doesn't matter if you have all your positions filled. It doesn't matter if you're serving 100 million clients. The question is, you're getting good outcomes, and that's what it comes down to. So I don't think any of us, I think we'd all agree, David and Kim and others that were on the table trying to maneuver this document to something useful, feel like we're quite there yet. But at least we're trying to pull data into it that we feel address those questions, and certainly put it at a layperson level so that someone could go to the website, take a look at it with some basic narrative underneath it, and try to figure out what it was that this, how we're doing as a state in terms of serving kids. Next slide, Albert. So this is probably the most basic thing that we present, and all of these data are data that we have at CAMHD in a fact book that David and I put together every year, and actually 10, 15, 20 times more data than this. We can drill down, but all of these are just snapshots of how an agency is doing. You know, I often say that when you present data don't really answer questions for you. They really just help you craft informed questions. And that's what we're trying to do here is get you to the next level, get you to the basic part, so you know how many kids we're serving, how much it costs. Then you can ask the next question, well, what kinds of kids are being served? That's not going to be answered in this hyper report. You have to go to the CAMHD's annual report and take a look at some of those things to answer those questions. But you get a start with these kinds of things. So here you take a look at CAMHD's data, and this top line here is the total registered kids. You can see we had a little dip down there, and we were worried for a while, but things started creeping up again, and so we're starting to serve more kids, because it's certainly because there's not an unmet need out there. I mean, we are not meeting everyone's need. There was some problems going on, communication issues. I think some of those things are starting to come together, and so the numbers of kids that were actually being registered at CAMHD now is going up steadily. On top of this red line here, that's the contracted provider services. We serve. We have contracts for, I don't know, it's like 20, 25 different agencies that provide different levels of care services, and that's what that red line is, and that's been creeping up a little bit too, although it's kind of steady, but our budget to contract with providers has been pretty steady also. This green line is the newest thing that we've been taking a look at, and those of you know a lot about CAMHD, and I'm assuming you do know CAMHD, because I'm not going to explain very much about CAMHD here, I'm just going to go through the slides, is that we have our mental health care coordinators, and they are sort of the liaison between the youth and the parent and then that contracted provider. But they also provide services themselves too, case management services, some do assessments, And we weren't measuring that really that well before. And so in the past year or so, we've got much better at measuring it. We're taking a look at it. Before it looked like there was this giant gap when this green line wasn't there. Like, geez, you got all these kids that you got registered. How come this amount here aren't getting served? Well, they actually were. Some of them don't need these contracted provider services yet or are in transition. But in the meantime, they were getting case managed, and now we're recording that. So you can see the gap is very small. And that difference there is probably just kids waiting to actually get into the flow of the service provision. So this is, we had the red light, yellow light, green light as part of the hyper report. We gave ourselves a green light on this because things seem to be moving in the direction we want. Albert, next slide. So the next question, what kinds of services do you provide? So you can get a snapshot of that. So now you know how many kids we're serving, very basic stuff. You probably would have a ton more questions after you saw that first graph. But we don't really go into that in hyper report. You have to go to another report that we do. So we make you go to our website to take a look at it. The next one is your services procured. All the services, so there's different levels of care. You've got out of home, intensive home community, outpatient supportive services, and crisis stabilization. By far and away, our biggest service provision is the intensive home and community. And that includes things like MST, IH, or partial hospitalization. But this is where we serve the most kids. It's by far and away, about 3 times. In order to get, and we break this down much finer when we actually go into our annual report too, but just for purposes of the hyper report, you get to look, this is the levels of care. These are the kinds of services that we provide. And you probably want to say, well, what are each of these different services? You gotta go dig a little further. That's not in the hyper report. That's not what the hyper report's about. It's supposed to help you craft the questions you want to ask and then dig down to the next level. Next slide, Albert. And the next question is, how much did it cost to offer these services? You can see far and away in this one here is that out of home is the most expensive, which is one of the reasons, not the sole reason, but one of the reasons that you try to move into intensive home and community because it's not as expensive. But there's also a lot of research out there suggesting that serving kids out of the home is not the best thing, and it's not good for the kids. So the irony is it's more expensive to do it. So the strategy is, and I can't say this is a blanket statement because there's individual cases where this may not be the case, but for the most part, the strategy is least restrictive care. And that usually happens when you're serving the kid in the home and the community with their parents. And here you got the large number of money spent. And look at the price per youth, over $50,000 per youth to do that. Now, it isn't all just dollars and cents. You want a kid to get well, so if it costs a lot of money, you do it. But you try also, if there's other methods that are less expensive, you go there. And there's a lot of research that suggests these other alternatives can have a positive impact on certain kids, and that's the trick, finding which kids go into those services so you can have a good outcome and the kid, and it's not as expensive. Next slide. And finally, this is the outcomes. We have many outcomes. We have Ohio scales, we have the CAFIS, we have MTPS, we have several assessments that we look at in terms of how kids are doing over time. And it's if you could draw a pretty straight line to this thing here, and that is about 60% of kids show improvement in the CAFIS over time. As a researcher, and trying to put my evaluator hat on, my first question is, well, what about the other 40% of the kids? So we don't want to put a laurel around us and raise our hands in celebration that 60% of the kids are getting better. We got to take a look at those other 40% and say, well, why can't we get them to show improvement also? And so that's a constant source of taking a look at it, looking at how not only how well we're doing, but how poorly we're doing and how we could do better. And some of that is the mix of the level of care, and that's the continual game we're playing. So I'm just going to leave it there. Those are the actual 4 pieces of data that we supply to the hyper report each year. And we'll be doing it, I guess, in a couple months. David and I will be running the annual report, and then the new data for these will be added into the hyper report. And again, it may change over time as we take a look at it, but for now, I think it's a vast improvement over where it was, but it could get better.